Hey everybody, this video is called What Would Job Say to God? And tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Job, where we're going to be looking at chapter 10. And if you put yourself in Job's shoes, losing everything that you had and taking on this unbearable, painful situation with his health, what would you say to God? That is a question I want you to think about as we go through chapter 10 today. And so Job chapter 10, we're going to look at verse 1 through 7 to see what Job would say to God. It says, "My soul loathes my life, and I will give free course to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Show me why you contend with me. Does it seem good to you that you should oppress, that you should despise the work of your hands and smile on the counsel of the wicked? Do you have eyes of flesh? Or do you see as man sees? Are your days like the days of mortal man? Are your years like the days of mighty man? So that you should seek for my iniquity and search out my sin. Although you know that I am not wicked, and there is one who can deliver from your hand." So it seemed like Job is starting out chapter 10 here with the mindset of, let's get the boxing gloves on. I'm just starting to warm up. I got a problem with God and he's going to know about it. And so we see that Job says he will speak in bitterness of his soul. In verse 2, we see the word condemn me, and it's not speaking of the condemnation of Job's soul, but his physical suffering as a punishment. And so Job, like sometimes with us, we might, during tragedy or hard times, we might question God. We see that Job holds nothing back in his misery. But we see that Job is asking God to show him why all this had happened. And we've all been there ourselves during tragic times and grief. God, why did this happen? I still ask that question. Why, God? Why would you take my oldest son at the age of 10 with no forewarning? So Job, we can find ourselves at many times relating to. And we're in the holiday season right now, and many people are grieving their family that they've lost. They might not have any family left, or very few family that they might not even get to speak to. And that is a question they might be asking right now. God, why? Why is it like this? And so Job, he held nothing back in regard to speaking to God about his misery. But Job asked God to show him why all this had happened. And in verse 3, the work of your hands is a biblical expression identifying what someone produces, in this case man, as created by God. Also seen later in Job chapter 14, verse 15, in the book of Psalm 102, verse 25. And because he believed he was innocent, Job humorously, somewhat sarcastically, asked God if he was as limited in his ability to discern his spiritual condition as were Job's friends. And obviously we know that God knows everything, that even what we can't understand, God understands, because God is sovereign with a plan. And so Job, he concludes by affirming that God did not know his innocence and that there was no higher court of appeal. And Job's present distress twisted the perception of God to the point where he couldn't see what only could be seen by the eye of faith that goes beyond the sight of the present circumstances. So Job, he can't see past what's in front of him right now. In verse 8 through 12, it says here, "Your hands have made me and fashioned me in intricate unity, yet you would destroy me. Remember, I pray, that you have made me like clay, and will you turn me into dust again? Did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? Clothe me with skin and flesh, and knit me together with bones and sinews? You have granted me life and favor, and your care has preserved my spirit. So again, we see that Job returns to the question, why was I born? And you might remember that, I believe, from chapter 3. Job is asking once again to God, why was I born? And the answer that God had created him is given in magnificent language, indicating that life begins at conception. So for those that, believe in the morning after pill or abortion, up to 6 weeks or whatever, Job held to the view that life began at conception. And Job knew that God was the author of creation and mankind. And Job, he held on to the same understanding as King David in Psalm 139 verse 14. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. In Genesis 2:7, Job understood that mankind came from the dust of the ground. And I think that's a wonderful poetry that Job illustrates the fashioning of his body by 3 pictures. That first off, Job is saying that man is like a vessel of clay shaped by a potter. And I think of the language that the Apostle Paul and the prophet Isaiah used as God is the potter and we are the clay. And number 2, man is like cheese poured out by a cheese maker. So you probably never heard of that analogy without seeing that in the Bible here. But Job sees us kind of like cheese poured out by the cheese maker. So the author. And number 3, man is like a garment woven by a weaver. So Job felt, though, as God wanted to destroy him. And in verse 12, Job gave thanks to God for 3 wonderful things. So even in the middle of questioning God, Job is responding with gratitude. He is giving gratitude to God for first off, life. And second off, divine favor. And third off, divine visitation. In verse 13 through 17, it says, "And these things you have hidden in your heart. I know that this was with you. If I sin, then you mark me, and will not acquit me of my iniquity. If I am wicked, woe to me. Even if I am righteous, I cannot lift my head. I am full of disgrace. See the misery. If my head is exalted, you hunt me like a fierce lion. And again, you show yourself awesome against me. You renew your witnesses against me, and increase your indignation toward me. Changes and war are ever with me." So Job wondered if God had planned in his divine purpose to not be merciful to him. And, this was going to take place because God didn't want to show him mercy. And Job said that God seemed to be sending people to accuse him. And with each witness came another wave of condemnation and further psychological and emotional suffering. And Job knew that God knew all the causes and answers for his condition, yet God didn't tell him, while we know what happens behind the heavenly scenes. So to Job, he's like, what is happening, God? He doesn't have that same vision that we get in the Revelation from chapter 1 and 2. And so Job didn't, so we should be able to sympathize with his failings. And Job felt that God was no help to him in all his present distress. And he felt that he was prey to God, the prey of God. Prey, not P-R-E-Y, not P-R-A-Y, but P-R-E-Y. Kind of like when you think of a red-tailed hawk and a pigeon below. So Job felt that he was the prey for God who came against him. He uses like a fierce lion in his, speech. In verse 18 through 22, it says, "Why then have you brought me out of the womb? Oh, that I had perished, and no eye had seen me. I would have been as though I had not been. I would have been carried from the womb to the grave. Are not my days few? Cease, leave me alone, that I may take a little comfort, before I go to the place from which I shall not return, to the land of darkness and the shadow of death, a land as dark as darkness itself, as the shadow of death without any order, where even light is like darkness." So Job, he returns to his question of why God allowed him to be born. But he was asking God for the reason he allowed it this time to occur. God, why did you allow me to be born, is what Job's saying. And Job said that since I was destined to all these ills from my birth, at least give me a break. Give me some breathing room during the brief days left to me before I die. In Job, death was gloomily described as darkness. And as the point in the story, Job simply preferred God to leave him alone. So Job, in his mental state, he's like, God, just leave me alone. And he didn't recognize that it was only because God didn't leave him alone is why he's gotten to endure this far. And if God had really left Job alone, he would have been completely destroyed at the hands of the enemy or despair. In verse 22, to the land of darkness and shadow of death, it shows the book of Job reflects the difficult apprehension of the truth of the afterlife in the Old Testament. And we're going to speak about a little bit about Job's theology in the Old Testament and why it's very vague about the afterlife. So to wrap up here, we look tonight at what Job would say to God if he was standing before God. And we see he would ask God, why are you doing this? And we talked a little bit about that on verse 3, the works of your hands, as a biblical expression identifying what someone produces. And I want to look at Hebrews chapter 1, verse 10. So Hebrews 1, verse 10. It says here, "And you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands." So we see in the New Testament, the work of your hands is also used. And the Hebrews author identified Christ as creator. In verse 8 through 12 in Job shows us that Job would ask, "Why do you inflict me as I am your creation? God, you created me. Why are you doing this to me?" And verse 13 through 17 shows us that Job would ask God to reveal his sinful cause within Job himself. And so we see the chapter ends with Job asking God to, if you're not going to take away these problems, just leave me alone, God. He's speaking out of his flesh. And we see a cloudy understanding of the afterlife in the Old Testament, and we're going to see it again coming up. Let's go to 2 Timothy chapter 1. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10 says, "But has now been revealed by the appearing of our Savior Jesus Christ, who has abolished death and brought life and immortality to light through the gospel, to which I was appointed a preacher, an apostle, and a teacher of the Gentiles," says the Apostle Paul. So Jesus brought life and immortality to light. And that's where we're going to wrap up today's video. We are officially right around the quarter completion mark through the book of Job. So about 25% of the way through the book of Job. And we'll see you next as we're going to look at a time to be determined, the first speech of Zophar. So the third friend, Zophar. So have a great rest of your night. God bless, and we'll see you for that.